Podcasting Q&A for September 25th, 2017. Hello, I'm Daniel J. Lewis from the Audacity to Podcast.com. I've got some fun questions on podcasting lined up. These are questions I've received in advance of this live session, but I'll also address questions that come in while I'm recording this live. So a couple questions are about Feedburner, which way to use Feedburner, raw, bare, certain things like that. Also with iOS 11, what's some good practice with bonus episode types, and a question about getting interviews and possibly getting access to places to get pictures and interviews, and a question about how podcasting is providing competition to radio. If these interest you, stick around, but there could also be other questions that come up in the live chat room while I'm doing this live on Mondays at 2 p.m. Eastern Time over at the audacitytopodcast.com/live. So if you're watching live and you have a question, post it in the comments and I'll get to it when I can. And if you're watching the replay of this, either on Facebook or on YouTube, then make sure that you enable notifications for when I go live in the future, and send me your questions that you'd like to answer. A more concise question is better. You can email those to feedback@theaudacitytopodcast.com. So, first question came from JD Sutter. He asked, I know you've mentioned in the past how you use Feedburner for some of your shows in its, quote, raw, unquote, or, quote, bare, unquote, state. Do you have a blog post or podcast episode where you enumerate the actual settings you use? Or is it as simple as just deactivating all customizations and just letting the tags, etc., be written at the source feed? Feedburner is one of those things that you hear I'd say some uninformed podcasters often recommending Feedburner for all cases, and you'll hear some other podcasters recommend Feedburner for absolutely no cases. I think there is a reasonable middle ground. Feedburner does still provide a couple basic benefits, and I'll explain more of how I use Feedburner, or the rare cases when I might recommend Feedburner in a moment. But the two basic benefits from Feedburner are, one, a more stable cached version of your feed. So if you're using shared web hosting, you're generating your feed on your own website, and you sometimes have website downtime, Feedburner puts your feed somewhere else. They cache a version of your feed. They're making a copy and rehosting it for you. So if people are subscribed to the Feedburner version of your feed and your website goes down, then your podcast doesn't go down. That's a pretty nice benefit. But if you have good podcast hosting or a good web host, then you don't need to be concerned with Feedburner. And if you're using someone else to generate your RSS feeds, like a good podcast host such as Libsyn or Blueberry PowerPress Sites or Blueberry podcast publishing platform that they offer, if you're using a good system like that, you don't have to worry about your feed going down because their system is really designed to keep your feed online. If you're using SoundCloud, be worried about your feed going down. The other reason to use Feedburner would be ownership over your feed. If whatever your source feed is not something that you can own, transfer, or control. For example, if you use Audio Boom, if you use SoundCloud, yes, you can transfer it out, but SoundCloud, sometimes I wonder if SoundCloud just might disappear overnight or disconnect the podcast feature overnight, or if you're using some kind of questionable service. The one other case when Feedburner might be a potential use for you is if you are using a service that doesn't let you insert all of the podcast tags into your RSS feed. For example, a service like blogger.com or Blogspot that doesn't allow you to add the podcast RSS tags to your feed like those iTunes tags. Yes, it can include an enclosure in your podcast feed, but it can't be a full podcast feed with all of those enclosure or with all of the iTunes tags, especially not the new iTunes tags. So you could use Feedburner to add that. But if you want to use Feedburner as kind of a stable way to host your feed, just that extra assurance, which I don't really recommend. But if for some reason you want to do it, or you're on Feedburner, you don't want to completely leave Feedburner, but you also don't want to use the SmartCast feature, which is really messed up. SmartCast feature can do some bad things to your RSS feed, and it's also missing all of the new iTunes tags. So what I recommend, JD, when I talk about using it in a raw or bare state, yes, it's as simple as deactivating everything, turning off every single feature that they have inside of Feedburner so that it's really simply a pass-through. It's not changing anything about my RSS feed. I'm not using the stats. I'm not using their SmartCast feature. I'm not using any of their extra features to, quote, enhance, unquote, my feed. I'm using it only to simply cache or rehost the feed. And even then, you might want to consider using the My Brand feature in Feedburner, which allows you to do a technical thing called placing a CNAME record in your domain. So you could have feeds.myawesomepodcast.com/podcast name, and that would be your RSS feed instead of feeds.feedburner.com. A technical problem that you could run into there is if you get SSL on your own website and you enable it in a particular way that's strict with subdomain protection, then it could cause problems accessing your feed in the future. The actual technical details of it are deep and technical. So I'm not going to go into that in all that much detail, but know that HTTPS could be an issue. Because, for example, you can't get HTTPS on the Feedburner feed if it's using your own domain, because you can't install your own certificate on your own domain if you're using the My Brand feature. So really, just as much as possible, avoid Feedburner. It's really not something that you need to worry about. From the chat room, several comments coming in while I'm recording. So I do this live Mondays at 2 p.m. Eastern at theaudacitypodcast.com/live. Mike Wilkerson said, I've thought about, quote, relaunching, unquote, Evergreen content via iTunes, and I'm wondering if there's a value in killing/launching a new or different RSS feed effort for it. Thoughts and questions and later discussions are welcome and wide open. So relaunching Evergreen content, there are a couple ways that you could do this. You said if there's value in killing/launching a new/different RSS effort for it. If you have a lot of episodes, more than 300 episodes, then they won't show up inside of Apple Podcasts to new subscribers, in the catalog or in the store if you're on the iTunes side of things. But people who subscribe to your podcast can download as many episodes as are in your RSS feed. So you look at a show like macOS Ken, and it has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of episodes, actually almost 2,000 episodes in the RSS feed. But in Apple Podcasts, you'll see only the latest 300. Also, only the latest maximum 300 episodes will be searchable in Apple Podcasts and in iTunes. So if you have evergreen content that is truly relevant years later and more than 300 episodes later, and if you want that content to be searchable, then it needs to be somehow visible to Apple Podcasts. Now, that 300 limit, that's something set by Apple Podcasts. So if you have a couple hundred episodes and you only see your latest 10 or 20, that is set by your RSS feed. So you can go in and change your RSS feed to display more than however many episodes you're displaying. But if you have more than 300 episodes, then Apple limits how many they display in the catalog, and whatever episodes are outside of that 300 limit can't be found. But once you subscribe, your subscriber is connected directly to your feed so they can download those older episodes. So what you could consider doing is maybe your main podcast has all of your episodes, or maybe it has only a certain number of episodes, like episodes, let's say 200 to 300 or 300 to 400 or 300 to 500. It's up to you how you want to split it up. John Lee Dumas does this with EO Fire podcast because he has so many episodes now, and he has a lot of old episodes that still have timeless content, and he wants them to be searchable. So what you could then do is, yes, launch a new podcast feed inside of Apple Podcasts, and using whatever system you used to create your RSS feed in the first place, create an additional feed. It could be as simple as a category feed of some sort, and you put your episodes in that category. It could be like Archive 1 and then Archive 2 and Archive 3 and such. And each archive might contain 100 episodes, or maybe 200, or maybe 300 episodes. It depends on how many episodes you have in your back catalog. Then you could submit that to Apple Podcasts. And I would recommend a couple things if you do that. One is, in the description and in the title, make it obvious that this is an archive of back episodes. Like maybe the title is, let's say your podcast is My Awesome Podcast. So it's My Awesome Podcast hyphen episode archive 1 to 300, something like that. And in the description, you say these are the first 300 episodes, and then, or these are episodes 1 through 300. Go over to My Awesome Podcast, regular one, to get the full thing. Make your cover art obvious. Make everything about that podcast obvious that it's the archive. If possible, if like you're hosting the feed differently, you may even want to consider changing the titles for those episodes, or changing even the media to say, hey, if you're listening to this, you're listening to the archive. Highly recommend you go subscribe to the main podcast so you get all of the new episodes, because this archive will only contain episodes 1 through 300. Nothing new will be added to it. So if your content is timeless, and if you're beyond that 300 limit, then I do recommend that you consider doing that. The Audacity to Podcast has over 300 episodes now, and so it's therefore above that 300 limit. So I keep thinking of going in and submitting an archive of a version of the first 100 episodes or something. I just haven't had the time to put something like that together. But that is something that I'm considering, because I feel like those first 10 episodes are still timeless, although, or not 10 episodes, now it's at 24 episodes tomorrow. So some of them are good, some of them maybe not so good. I might just let them not be searchable in iTunes, because they're not my best episodes, and they're not all necessarily timeless content. I might be replacing some of that content with other things. But we'll see what I think of to do later. Speaking of episode 324, the next episode of the Audacity to Podcast will be why iOS 11 is great for podcasts and podcasting. I know some people may not like iOS 11, especially the new podcast app, because it's different. They changed things. But in episode 324 of the Audacity to Podcast, which publishes on September 26th, you'll hear why I think the changes are good for not only the industry as a whole, but also good for the consumers, getting more people consuming podcasts, making it a better experience for the listener or the viewer, and some of the cool things that are available to podcasters. So with that in mind, the next question is from Andrew Wang, asking, with iOS 11, what's the best practice for titling / numbering a bonus episode type? This is something I was thinking about with my own podcast that has seasons. That's my Once Upon a Time podcast for the TV show Once Upon a Time. I've been going in, or having my assistant go in and update all of the tags for that podcast so that they have the correct episode numbers and season numbers. And I've played around with the bonus and trailer stuff. And for that podcast, I've decided, because for 6 years we've had simple sequential numbering, I think I'll continue that each episode will be a regular episode, not a bonus, not a trailer, even though we're probably going to end up splitting out the spoilers for upcoming episodes into their own episode. I don't think it would be good to have that as a spoiler or as a trailer for the next episode. It just starts to get complicated with episode numberings and stuff for that particular show. Because we're so far into it, I don't really want to change our numbering format. So we're going to keep those episodes as normal episodes, regular episodes, not use the bonus or trailer. The times we might use bonus would be if it's a video episode, like we did our unboxing video of this season DVD and Blu-ray. So that as well for the next season, when we do an unboxing video, that will be a bonus, and it won't have an episode number attached to it. But in your case, bonus and trailer kind of position the episode differently relative to what it's attached to. So each episode can have a season number and an episode number, but those are optional fields. So a bonus or a trailer is attached to something. If you don't give, let's say you do a trailer episode. If it's simply a trailer and it has no season and no episode number attached to it, then it will be considered a trailer to your entire show. If you attach a season number to it, then it will be considered a trailer to that season. If you attach an episode number to it, and even a season and episode number as well, then it will be considered a trailer to that episode. So, logically then, if you've published 90 episodes and you release a trailer, the trailer should have the season number or the episode number 91 because it's the trailer for the next episode. Or if it's a trailer for the next season, then it should be attached to that specific season. So think of it in that sense. What are you attaching it to? That episode needs to either already exist or it's about to exist. Trailer comes before what it's attached to, and a bonus comes after what it's attached to. So if you're doing some kind of dramatized podcast, the trailer is letting people know what's coming in the next episode. Then you do that episode. That's a normal episode. Then you do some kind of behind the scenes, or you do Q&A on that episode or something like that. That could then be a bonus that's attached to that same episode number. So all three of those, quote, episodes, unquote, could have the same episode and season number, but they appear differently because they're different types of episodes. Apple Podcasts does still sort them based on, for the most part, date. So if they're all in the same season and you have bonuses and trailers, they'll still sort by publication date. So make sure that lines up with how you want them to sort as well, because other podcast apps will sort them by publication date and might not know the seasons and the episode numbers, stuff like that. And the bonus and trailer, that won't make a difference to other podcast apps. So when you're talking about the bonus episode type, if this is a bonus, think of it this way. Is the bonus attached to a previous episode? If yes, then it should be a bonus episode type. Or if it's the kind of bonus that can stand alone on its own in some way, like our unboxing video for our Once Upon a Time podcast, then it could be without an episode number. So, but if your episode, if it's kind of like a normal episode, but for some reason you're releasing it as a bonus, like maybe it's 2 episodes this week because you had something really special to announce, maybe then release it as a regular episode. But look at it as a bonus needs to be attached to something, a specific episode or season, or it could be attached to the entire show. But a bonus will list separately inside of Apple Podcasts. So if you do a normal show that doesn't have seasons and you make a bonus episode, that bonus will appear up at the top and be separate from the other things, depending on certain other tags. The way Apple Podcasts works, it's really fluid with certain conditions in if you're using these tags or not using these tags, and it will display differently. So think of it as bonus is attached to something that came before it. For our Once Upon a Time podcast, I was thinking about doing the bonuses and trailer stuff, but I'm just going to keep it simple, and everything will be a regular full episode. Rachel Irvin asked, how do I get interviews with people or use my podcast to get in to take pictures or interview people? Rachel, I highly recommend an episode that I did a few months ago called How to Get Press Access for Your Podcast. Go to theaudacitytopodcast.com/press access. Here's a quick review of some things to do. First is you have to position your podcast seriously. Make sure your website looks professional. Make sure your branding looks professional. Make sure every aspect of your podcast looks like this is a serious endeavor. So your email address too. Don't make it myawesomepodcast@gmail.com. Make it something like media@myawesomepodcast.com. Brand your email address in that way because that shows a lot more seriousness. Consider making a press kit or a media kit of some sort. When you approach these companies, approach it not as, hey, I've got this little hobby podcast I do. Can I get in for free? Can I have free stuff? Can I interview this person? But approach it as, this is this thing I do that reaches your ideal audience, or you have something that's extremely relevant to my audience. I would like to cover this for my audience. And then you can ask about, what does it take to get press access? Positioning yourself is really important here. Having a serious looking website, so you're not on Blogspot, you're not on only a Libsyn.com site. You have a branded site that looks good and looks like you're taking this seriously. And sometimes you just have to persist. They might say, what are your numbers? And you might have to show them your numbers. And if they say, no, you don't have big enough numbers, then you can appeal it. You can say, well, I know we don't have big numbers, but that's because we have a smaller niche. And the people who listen to us listen because we focus on this specific thing. So, for example, maybe you don't have the iPhone gaming podcast. You have the Angry Birds gaming podcast. So you cover everything related to Angry Birds. And you know there are going to be people exhibiting with Angry Birds stuff at some kind of event, or cast members of the movie or whatever that you want to talk to. And then you can say, I know I don't have the numbers, but we have an engaged, relevant audience. Our audience comes to us because all we give them is Angry Birds content. And that naturally attracts a smaller but more niche audience. And so they'd love it if they could get an insider look at this thing that's coming up, this event, this product, this service, this whatever it is. So you're communicating that value and relevance. And many times you have to persist because they might say no. So you might have to just wait a couple weeks, contact them again, or pose a question to them. Like, okay, what would it take to be able to get in? Go back and listen to that episode at theaudacitypodcast.com/press access. I go into a lot more detail over there with some other recommendations of positioning yourself for success with interviews or with press access, how to handle some of that stuff. So I think that episode will really help you a lot more, Rachel. Scott Orr asked, is there really a number one podcast in iTunes? What about number one in the blank category? Well, many people will say, I launched to number one in iTunes or number one in such and such category. Well, probably not. New and noteworthy is what many people talk about when they say we launched into something like that, the top of Apple Podcasts or something. There is no numbering system in new and noteworthy. It is not a ranking system at all. You look at it and you see no numbers. Yes, there may be an upper left position that you see for a podcast. That doesn't mean that's any better or, quote, ranks any higher than any of the other podcasts. It's simply that's where Apple put the podcast. Maybe because of timing, maybe because that's just the way their system worked, that they put it in the queue and it randomly put it there. So being in that upper left corner of new and noteworthy really doesn't mean anything as far as ranking. Doesn't mean you have more subscribers, doesn't mean you have more downloads, doesn't mean you have more reviews, doesn't mean you're more popular than any of the other podcasts in the category. And to get in there, you don't have to have more downloads, more reviews, more episodes, anything like that. If you really look at the podcasts in there, you'll see that it breaks all of the formulas that many, quote, gurus, unquote, talk about. Like they'll say, oh, you have to launch with this certain number of episodes and you have to get ratings and reviews and you have to do this and that in order to get into new and noteworthy. Well, no, they may have done that and they also ended up in new and noteworthy. But that doesn't mean that because they did those things, they ended up in new and noteworthy. When you actually look at the podcasts in there, you'll see some where they have a 30-second preview and that's it. And they're new and noteworthy. You'll see some that have no ratings and reviews, some that have hundreds of ratings and reviews. You'll see some by little nobody independent podcasters. You'll see some by the big name podcasters. You'll see all kinds of things. And you'll see then that there's no definite formula for it other than, and this is really the only formula you can come to the conclusion that exists, is your podcast has to be either new or noteworthy, to be a new and noteworthy, because it's a list of new or noteworthy podcasts. So new and noteworthy is not a ranking system. That's the main point of all of that. There is, however, that category and the top, quote, top podcast section, and you see it in the front page of Apple Podcasts as well as the individual categories. That is based on what's most popular right now. So it's not an all-time kind of thing. This is, I'm getting super distracted by a honking horn outside. I hate it when people's car alarms go off around here. That can happen to your podcasting. You have to decide, are you going to either pause, edit it out, just let it exist, whatever. That one was particularly distracting. Inside of Apple Podcasts, when you look at those top podcasts, what you won't actually see there are the absolute top, most popular ever podcasts. The reason for that is Apple designed those lists to be more dynamic. If it was truly a top downloaded or most popular or something like that, if it was truly that, then most of the time you would always see the same few podcasts in the top. Now, which podcasts those are, who knows? It could be Mark Maron's podcast. It could be anyone's podcast really in there that you don't normally see in there, but it could be there because they have more subscribers than anyone else. Lifetime, total subscribers, and most downloads right now. However, Apple wanted to rate that. But where it is, the way it is now is it's based on new subscriptions within the last 24, 48, and 72 hours, kind of weighted with the more recent stuff. So when you look at those lists, it's kind of like the New York Times bestsellers list. The New York Times bestsellers list is not a list of all-time ever bestsellers, because you would see number one result on there would be the Bible. That's the all-time best-selling book. It sold more copies than any other book. Pilgrim's Progress would also probably be in that top list, and it would always be there. But instead, the bestsellers list is more fluid. It's more time-based. These are the books that are best-selling right now. Same thing for Apple Podcasts with the top podcast ranking. These are the podcasts that are getting the most subscriptions, which is kind of like the currency of podcast, a subscription. These are getting the most subscriptions right now. That's why it's more fluid. That's why you might see a podcast jump all the way to number one and then fall completely off the list. They got a whole lot of new subscribers, a big burst of new subscribers. And then they don't get as many new subscribers. Maybe they reach their main saturation point or something like that, and then they fall off the list. So yes, if you get a podcast that today, you launch your podcast and you get 10,000 new subscribers today, oh yeah, you'll jump to number one in all of Apple Podcasts. Regardless of your category, you'll be number one. But then for the next couple weeks, you get one or two new subscribers. You will fall off that chart very quickly because it's based on new subscriptions. So, is there really a number one? Yeah, there is, but we don't know what it truly is. And when you understand how the category rankings work, and you can see that it's more fluid, it's more time-based, then you can know this is what's number one right now. Or not even like that. This is what's getting the most, this is not the number one, let me phrase this correctly. This is getting the most new subscribers right now. But it's not that it has the most total subscribers. Your search results kind of affect that, but then that's a separate issue. Joseph Cherry asked, how about Squarespace for podcasting? It can work. Don't really recommend it. Squarespace is better at making websites and really nice websites, and they've made their system really easy. And you can use it to create a podcast RSS feed. It doesn't give you a whole lot of flexibility, but here's the main thing to help you decide. Does Squarespace support the new iTunes tags? If not, then I don't recommend them at all. I don't recommend any tool anymore that does not support the new iTunes RSS tags. And that means, unfortunately, Spreaker is off my recommendation list until they fully support it. They launched with initial support, partial support of the new iTunes tags, but not complete support. So until they have complete support, I can't recommend Spreaker anymore. Did I say Stitcher earlier? I meant Spreaker. If I said Stitcher, I meant Spreaker. Podbean, Blueberry, PowerPress, Libsyn, even some of the other new fringe podcast hosts. Like I heard that I think Podiant, however it's pronounced. A couple of those, I don't know about Fireside, but a couple of the fringe ones that are new to the space do also support the new tags. So that's cool. I can't necessarily recommend them for other reasons because of their stats, their history, their business model, their features that they do or don't have. The reason why I and many others continue to recommend Blueberry and Libsyn so much is because these are companies that give you full freedom. They give you full control, and their stats are standard. They conform to guidelines that have existed for years. And they're also conforming to the new IAB guidelines, doing some refinements in the way that things are measured based on new information that we've had in the last few years that we didn't have years ago when the Association of Downloadable Media set forth the first standard for how a podcast download would be measured. Now we have a lot more data that we can use for assumptions, yes, because all stats are based on assumptions. A lot of things are based on assumptions, really, and it's a matter of what assumptions you take. All right, moving back a little bit in the chat, Mike Wilkerson said, when typing in titles or subjects inside the iTunes search field, I'm curious, is there anything indicated by a podcast that is, say, listed 7th versus one of the podcasts that is listed in the 6th before it? What does iTunes use to make those general rankings, and how can a podcaster improve their ranking or better their number? iTunes search rankings are different from iTunes category rankings. And I talk more about this inside of the SEO for Podcasters course, which, by the way, is included in your membership at podcastersociety.com. You don't have to pay any extra for podcast or for SEO for Podcasters course, or you can buy the SEO for Podcasters course as a standalone over at the audacity-to-podcast.com. So when you enter a search into Apple Podcasts, what shows up in what order is based on basically two things. One is keyword match. So if you search for parsnips, the Audacity to Podcast is never going to show up, regardless of how many subscribers I have, because my podcast does not match the keyword parsnips. But if I have the Parsnips podcast, well, that does match. So first thing is keyword match. There may be a little bit of keyword density to it, but it doesn't really seem to be the case. So it's really about, does it match? The second part is lifetime subscriptions. This isn't about the new subscriptions, but total lifetime subscriptions. For example, go into iTunes, search for the Apple Podcasts, search in Apple Podcasts for Once Upon a Time. And my podcast, which I'm pretty certain is probably the most popular, gets the most downloads, even though the TV show is really failing or falling. Popularity is falling, that is. Our podcast about the TV show is active. We have a whole bunch of episodes, over 300 episodes. We've been podcasting since the beginning. And we show up number 2. The number 1 podcast in a search for Once Upon a Time is the official Once Upon a Time podcast from ABC. So that makes a lot of sense that it would show up number one because they have a lot more subscribers. But guess what? They haven't put out an episode since season 2 several years ago. So why are they ranking higher? It's because they have more lifetime subscribers than we do. And it makes sense because they're ABC. They promoted it through official channels. They have an audience of millions, and they can send out an email, post it on their Facebook, their Twitter, anything like that, and say, hey, subscribe to our podcast. And they get tens of thousands of subscribers, maybe, when we only have a couple or a few thousand. So they rank number one, even though they've pod faded, because they have more lifetime subscribers. So to rank number one in a search, first, you have to match the search term. Then you need more lifetime subscribers. So it's not as fluid as like the top ranking, or it's not even as fluid as a Google search, because there's not as much about relevance. It's more about just a mere match. Like I did a test a while back for productivity because I wanted to find what was the number one search result for productivity. The number one result was the Art of Charm podcast, which, okay, they've had some content that was about productivity, but the Art of Charm is more about marketing and about personal branding and that kind of thing. And it's not like the Pick Up the Girl kind of podcast anymore. That was many, many years ago, and they shifted over. And it showed up number one in a search for productivity. It was because of one keyword match. And because of that, and their lifetime subscriptions, they showed up number one. Even though other productivity podcasts like Beyond the To-Do List, The Productive Woman, 5 a.m. Miracle, these kinds of podcasts are all about productivity and are more relevant, they didn't have as many lifetime subscribers. Back to my list of questions. Scott Smith asked, do you think podcasting is providing competition to AM/FM satellite radio? Can't remember the last time I listened to my car radio. Yes, I totally believe it's providing competition because, for one thing, the audience for broadcast radio is literally dying. A lot of young people today don't turn on the radio because we're so used to personalized content or control over our own content. Why would we let someone else decide what music we want to listen to? I mean, you look at, even with Pandora, which is curated for you, it's curated to your taste. Same thing with like Apple Music or some of these other services. They try to curate it toward your taste. So you say, this is the kind of music I like. I like this song. I dislike that song. You start to get a channel that is customized to your taste. So although you don't have full control over what song plays next, it's probably a song you'll like based on your tastes and based on certain algorithms and stuff like that. And that's not available on the radio. That's available through the internet. But podcasting as spoken word, yes, I do believe it's providing competition because in podcasting, it's so much more personal. It's so much more relevant and niche. You see a lot of these public radio personalities and radio hosts having big success in podcasting because they do know how to share a message or tell a story that has very broad appeal. And they also already have a huge audience, so they can say, hey, subscribe to my new podcast and get thousands of subscribers literally overnight. But for us as podcasters, and this is what initially attracted me to podcasting when I first discovered podcasts and started listening. Although I could hear talk radio is pretty much all about the same few things: politics, finances, religion, relationships, sports, local issues, and technology in some markets. That's pretty much it. So those 8 or so topics are what broadcast radio is usually about, 7 or 8, somewhere around there. And you see these and stories, some kind of stories, like, the NPRs are telling stories of certain things, local things, whatever. That's the same kind of stuff, the mass appeal podcast. But what attracted me to podcasts was I wanted something that was more niche. I wanted to know what was new in technology in the latest week. That's when I discovered This Week in Tech. I wanted to learn how to write and speak better with gooder grammar. And that's when I discovered Grammar Girl podcast. I wanted to laugh at certain things, and that's when I discovered comedy podcasts. I like certain TV shows, and I want to hear theories and news about particular TV shows, and I discovered TV show fan podcasts. That's all content that you don't get on the radio because it was niche. So yes, I think as people are exposed to the power of the niche, podcasts become big competition for the radio. And the radio people know that. They see their audience literally dying, maybe not literally seeing them die. The placement of literal is very important in that sentence. But they see that their audience is leaving radio, their audience is dying. They see that they have less appeal. They're competing with the device you carry with you everywhere. So you have the potential to carry a message everywhere. So the radio hosts and personalities know that podcasts are in competition. And when people discover the power of the niche, I think that's when podcasts really start to take off. Like, I don't listen to the big name podcasts. I'm not interested in broad appeal stuff. I don't want to hear This American Life. I hated Serial, actually. I could not get into season 1. I did not make it all the way through. Season 2, I listened to because I have a military background, so it kind of interested me, but I didn't really appreciate the style of telling this story. I couldn't care less about shows like Missing Richard Simmons or S-Town or other shows like that. I don't care. That's not the kind of content I want. I want niche content. So I'm listening to podcasts about podcasting or a podcast about a particular tool I use. So the only time I turn on the radio is if I'm out of podcasts. And if I'm out of podcasts, I don't turn on the radio. I'll use something like Pandora. But if Pandora is not available, I might listen to audiobooks. Or if audiobooks aren't available, I might listen to music that's already on my phone. Or even if that's not available, or if my Bluetooth earbuds aren't working, then I might hold the phone to my ear and listen to whatever it is through there. Even if that's not working, then I might choose to simply sit and drive in the car and think in silence about all of the things I have to think about. And if I have absolutely nothing to think about, then I might turn on the radio. Unless it's a commercial, and then I turn it off. I do not listen to the radio anymore at all. And a lot of other people, I am technically a millennial, though the scene, I really don't like being lumped into the millennial category, but because I was born in the 80s, I am technically a millennial. But I don't think like many of the other millennials do, but even they aren't as interested in listening to the radio. So yes, podcasts are competition with the radio. Scott Orr asked, how important is the HTTPS feature? That is the certificate. HTTPS is very important for a few reasons. First of all, security with anything on your website. People will want to know their information is safe and can't be intercepted. And HTTPS helps prevent that. So whether that's a simple contact form and they're entering their email address on there, like someone doesn't want to be in a coffee shop and have someone else intercepting their email address and spamming them after that. Wouldn't you hate it if you were in a coffee shop and you log into a website or you comment on someone's website and then the coffee shop automatically subscribed you to their email address or to their email newsletter because they captured your email address that you transmitted through some other website, an unsecure website. So HTTPS is really important for privacy. Simple privacy there, as well as security, especially if you're taking payment, logins, passwords, anything like that. You should really consider having HTTPS. It's also important now for search. because Google and other search engines are starting to prioritize what humans would prioritize, and they're constantly trying to tweak the algorithms to make them more human-like. Humans value privacy and security, and so search engines are also prioritizing websites that are secure. So it's totally possible, and the security weighs into other things. Having HTTPS gives extra weight to something. So it's possible that if you have two websites that for some reason their search ranking is completely equal, but one website is HTTPS and the other isn't, that secure site will rank higher. And Google is starting to kind of diminish the ones that are not secure. As far as where you get that certificate from, it's not as important unless you're taking payments. You can do a Let's Encrypt certificate. Or if you're using Cloudflare on your site, you can use Cloudflare. Exactly where the certificate comes from doesn't matter so much. If you have a personal website or a site people can simply comment or maybe log into for casual use. But if you're running a business, if you're taking payments, then you really need to consider having a higher level security site. I did a webinar for Podcaster Society where I talked about all things HTTPS and the different license levels and such. Like what Let's Encrypt offers and maybe what you can usually get for free in places is simply validating that the person who owns the domain has the security certificate. It's domain validation. It's very simple, very basic, but it does encrypt traffic to the site. So that's good at least. But it's kind of like saying, oh, you should trust me because you should trust me, or because I'm telling you you should trust me. It's self-validating, which isn't the best, self-signing like that. You can get third-party signed certificates where it's another company that says, yes, this organization owns this domain. So like Facebook, Google, and such, their domains are set so that there's some third party out there that validated they have control. So when you are on this site, yes, this other company has validated that the information you enter and all of your stuff is secure by that company that you're trusting with it. Then there's even extended validation, which is a little bit higher. It's what I actually use, and other companies use it too, which is the thing that gives you this nice little green bar and the name of the company in the address bar, which in my case has actually caused some confusion because the technical name of my company is D. Joseph Design, LLC. And so if you go to the Audacity podcast, my podcast reviews, Podcaster Society, those sites where I sell things, you'll see in the address bar is D. Joseph Design. It's a little confusing, I know. I've thought about changing the company name. That's just a big ordeal. But in the copyrights on all of those sites, it does say copyright D. Joseph Design as well, but no one really scrolls down to read that. HTTPS will also be important for a lot of other stuff too, with your podcast feeds and with your media hosting. Now, if you use Blueberry, if you use Libsyn, your media is already on HTTPS. You may not be linking to it that way, but that's okay. You don't have to rush into this. At some point, Apple did say that at some point they will be requiring HTTPS, but that probably won't be for many years. And it might even be something like if your podcast is already in Apple Podcasts and it's not secured, if it's not HTTPS yet, then it's fine. But any new podcasts will require HTTPS. That's my theory, is that they'll do it something like that. And then at some point they may, and this could be years from now that they do this, they may someday say, okay, you have 6 months to get your podcast switched over to HTTPS. And if it doesn't work, then it'll be removed from Apple Podcasts. That could happen. Will it? I don't know the actual likelihood of it happening, but it is something that could happen. All right, back to the comments. Several questions came in. Mike Wilkerson said, what's the over-under real story about the, quote, people, or have people send voicemail via the internet add-ons? I've implemented SpeakPipe recently and wondering what other options we might need to consider / their value. So these services, the first thing to know is never tell people, hey, use our SpeakPipe. Because no one knows what SpeakPipe is. Well, we as podcasters, some of us know what SpeakPipe is. But your audience doesn't know. They don't care what SpeakPipe is. So regardless of what tool you use, tell them, send a voice message through our website. Or maybe you use a tool that allows them to send a video message, and you can tell them, send a video message through our website. The actual use of these on all of my podcast websites, I've seen the use go down significantly over the last several years. It was pretty popular in the earlier days. It seemed like 5 years ago, earlier days of these tools. Now, though, I get maybe 1 or 2 per month, and that's it. I don't heavily promote it, but it is a nice way that someone could easily press record. The interesting thing about it, though, is it's kind of solving a problem that may not necessarily exist, at least not until the technology can be better implemented. Because let's think of it this way. I'm a podcaster. If I'm listening to your podcast and I want to send you audio feedback in the highest quality possible, I'm more likely to record it on my own equipment and send you the WAV or the MP3 file. You might be the same if you're a podcaster sending feedback to another podcaster. If you're not a podcaster, you're not familiar with that kind of stuff, then it's more likely that the SpeakPipe option or something like that will result in a lower quality, because when people click record, they most likely don't have a microphone the ideal distance from their voice. It's a microphone that's built into their web camera or into their computer, and that microphone is a few feet away from their voice. And it has all of this reverb that's being picked up because it's so far away from the voice, and maybe the noise from their computer, the fan, the hard drive, they're clicking on the keyboard and anything like that. It's picking all of that up primarily because of the distance, not the style of the microphone that it is, and their environment and their technique. And so the audio quality you get could actually be worse. Even though the potential is you get great audio quality, it could be worse because people don't know how to really get good audio quality, average people that is, with whatever built-in microphone they have. So you might actually get better, more consistent audio quality by simply using a telephone number, whether that be a Google Voice or something else like that, some kind of call-in number. But even the call-in numbers for our Once Upon a Time podcast, the call-ins have significantly decreased. I really don't get that many. The most recent voicemail I got even was someone that didn't understand the internet. It was a weird voicemail, very, very weird. And I got a couple of them too, and it's just very weird voicemail. Kind of question the person's sanity a little bit. So having these options can be nice. Embed them all on the same page, and you could tell people, hey, send us your feedback, and we provide multiple ways that you can send us feedback. You can record it, you can email it, you can write it out. Go to myawesomepodcast.com/feedback or myawesomepodcast.com/contact, and then you embed the contact information on that page. So you can put in a link or a button for your SpeakPipe, but don't tell people, send us a SpeakPipe. You don't know what that is. Don't tell them use SpeakPipe on your website. They don't know what that is. Make a button that says record a voice message. And when they click that, they see, oh, I can record a voice message. Well, that's profound. So that kind of thing, it really depends on the audience. It depends on how you implement it. Your results will vary. Commenting on something earlier, Andrew Wang said, in my case, I just launched my show this month. First 6 episodes are interviews. I edited this week's episode and extracted the discussion about the Equifax hack as a standalone episode. He's talking about the iTunes bonus thing. I see it as a bonus tied to the normal episode since it features the same guest. On the other hand, it includes a short monologue by me, the host, providing useful links to protecting your identity and freezing your credit. In that case, since it is kind of an expansion on something that was in a previous episode, I think the bonus episode type would be good for an episode like that. Going back to that issue that I talked about earlier. Michael Delaney said, Mr. Lewis, if big money gets into the podcasting world, do you see the FCC trying to tell podcasters what they can and cannot do? I do think so. There is already some requirements that podcasters really need to comply with. Like if you have an affiliate link, you have to disclose that you have that affiliate relationship. And keep an eye on these other platforms like Instagram and YouTube and certain things like that, and the way the FCC or the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, are cracking down on certain things or imposing certain requirements. And it's mainly around the idea of disclosure. As long as you run your business honestly, you don't try and scam people, you don't try and hide things, you don't try and trick people into using your affiliates or anything like that, or trick people out of their money. As long as you run an ethical business with your podcast, I think you would be okay with most of the stuff. So if you have an affiliate link, tell people it's an affiliate link. That's more ethical, and it would also then be in compliance with most things. I think at some point, yes, the FCC and FTC will recognize podcasting as a separate medium and probably simply include it with other things. Or like you look at the FCC and they have this list of banned words on the radio, on public broadcast media, what can and can't be in public media, in what's available, like just over the airs, no subscription. Now, that list doesn't apply to cable. That's why on cable you can have a lot of different stuff that you can't have on public radio or television, over the air stuff. Satellite also premium subscription kind of thing. And the FCC has certain rules about that. In other countries, their governing bodies also have rules as well as what's allowed and what isn't allowed. In podcasts, though, I think there would have to be a lot more of a police state in order for podcasts to really be so enforced on certain things, because podcasts are decentralized. That's the power of podcasting. Although, yes, Apple has a huge share of the pie in distribution, you can still allow people to subscribe to your podcast through Apple Podcasts without ever being in the Apple Podcast catalog or in iTunes. You can allow people to subscribe directly, and Apple can't stop that, and they won't stop that. There are certain closed ecosystems, and you have to abide by certain rules within those systems, but that doesn't mean you can't do a podcast. It might just mean you can't have your podcast included in someone else's private property. It's like, yes, you have freedom of speech. You can go on the corner of a street in public and say certain things as long as you're following common decency ideas, and you can say certain things. Now, coming into my home and saying those things in front of my family, that's a different issue because that's private property. It's the same thing. Apple Podcasts is a private property. Places of business are also private property. That's why certain places of business can put those stickers that say no concealed weapons permitted. They're private property. They can set different rules and can enforce those kinds of things. Emily Prokop said, we're in the subgeneration known as the Generation Oregon Trail. Yes, I think that's much, much better. There is a particular chip. I don't even know if they make it like an actual tortilla chip, a sort of healthy nacho chip that to me tastes like Oregon Trail. And the reason is that the first time I was ever exposed to Oregon Trail, I and a friend were playing it for hours, and we ate, I think, 2 bags of these chips. And so those chips taste like Oregon Trail to me. And Oregon Trail tastes like those chips. I'm double checking to make sure I covered all of the questions that came in the chat because it's time for me to go. Yep, that's everything. So thank you very much for the questions, the conversation. Thank you for watching this live. The next episode of the Audacity podcast publishes on September 26th, and it's about why iOS 11 is great for podcasts and podcasting. And this Saturday is International Podcast Day. I'll be presenting on how you can help podcasting grow. There will be a whole bunch of other really good presentations going along with that. And I'll be doing a local meetup too for Greater Cincinnati podcasters. So hang out with some other podcasters. Do something fun to celebrate podcasting. Talk to people that you meet on the street, in the grocery store, your banker, and talk to everyone about podcasting. Let them know, hey, it's International Podcast Day. Do you subscribe to any podcasts? What's your favorite TV show? Let me help you find a podcast. Or what's your favorite sports team? Let's look for a podcast about your favorite sports team. What kinds of topics do you like? Help them find a podcast they would like, which might not necessarily be your own podcast. People like Emily Prokop get off easy because her podcast is the kind of podcast a lot more people might be interested in, with it being the story behind certain stuff. Like she could say, hey, pumpkin spice is big right now. Do you know the story behind pumpkin spice? I've got an episode about that. You might like my podcast. Whereas if I go into a Starbucks and I'm talking to the Starbucks employee and I say, hey, I've got a podcast about podcasting. It'll teach you all about how to launch and improve your own podcast for sharing your passions and finding success. Would you like to subscribe? Starbucks employee would probably look at me and say, would you like whipped cream with that? Because it doesn't apply to them. So help the podcasting industry grow by suggesting relevant stuff to them. Thank you very much for joining me for this live podcasting Q&A. I do this live on Mondays at 2 p.m. Eastern at theaudacitytopodcast.com/live. Keep growing your podcast, and I'll see you next week.